Redditors who were raised in cults. When was the first time you realized something was wrong? After watching The Day After in the 80s, I asked my mom if we knew the nukes were coming. Who would she rather spend her last moments with, me or the cult leader? She chose him. I came up with my own survival plan after that. I was going to skateboard to safety. Not in a cult per se, but was in one of those evangelical mega churches. Started as a nice corner church, the party was genuine. I don't think that the pastor planned the whole thing. He seemed a genuine preacher until the church grew exponentially. Like went from a few hundred members to 15,000 in less than 2 years. Then his main focus was entertaining the masses, which drove him to do stupid things. Many weird things started happening. Especially, one day he had a revelation that the congregation needs to expand further and members have to, I'm serious, give out all the gold they were wearing. I know a lady that got into serious trouble with her husband because she gave away her gold wedding band. While asked Strawwoods when he promoted himself to apostle and renamed himself Paul. Apostle Paul. Okay. Had a conversation with my associate pastor about mega churches a couple weeks ago. I asked what he would do if our church gained a ton of members just like you said. He said we would need to split away immediately. Churches aren't meant to be mega churches. They're meant to be communities where people know and trust each other. Plus, he figured that no pastor or music leader could withstand the ego that came with a huge audience. When it came time for me to leave for my own mental health, I became the villain. And when confiding in my college tutor, she was horrified to learn even a fraction of what I had grown up with. She was the main encouragement I needed to get the duck out when I did. When the elders told me that I could no longer speak to my younger sister anymore because she was in bad standing with the organization. She's the only family I have left. They made her out to be this monster just because she wasn't actively going to church. That's when the glass shattered for me. When I realized that the doors to the 13-story former hotel building we were all living in was locked and you had to sign out to leave. No one from children to adults could leave without an explanation to where they were going and when they'd be back. Edit group operated under two names. IBLP Institute for Basic Life Principles. This was their outreach label, where they would go to churches and show this seminar to bring new gullible people into the fold. ATI Advanced Training Institute was for the people that actually wanted in deep and consisted of an entire homeschool curriculum to make sure your kids got brainwashed correctly. Pretty in-depth, interesting article written about the whole thing. Link. They masqueraded as just another Baptist sect, but it went way deeper. My family was highly involved for years, but the year we lived at their training center was actually horrifying. Strictly controlled what was allowed and out. Surveillance for everything. Sad part is most of the families that lived there were essentially slave labor that worked for the ministry and were given free room and board. Many of them had nowhere else to go and were trapped, even if they wanted to leave. I was 12 years old and my classmate from school died in a car accident. We were as close of friends as I was allowed to be with someone who wasn't in the cult. I asked my mom if I would see my friend in paradise after life, and she said no, because her parents weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. Then and now, I couldn't believe that an innocent 12-year-old wouldn't get a shot at everlasting life because of her parents. It was definitely the biggest crack in my ideology that only grew as I got into my teen years. This hits close to home for me. I was raised completely non-religious. We moved a lot when I was growing up, and in second grade I ended up in this tiny little farm school in southwestern Kansas. One day a kid was handing out miniature Bibles at lunchtime as one does in a public school. I had never seen one before, and asked what they were. An entire table full of kids gasped, glared at me, or snickered. One kid informed me, loudly, that I was going to heck, since I didn't read the Bible every day. Of course this made me upset, so I went and told the lunchtime monitor teacher that the other kid said I was going to heck for not reading the Bible. The woman looked down at 7-year-old me, crossed her arms, raised her eyebrows, and said yes, that's what I believe too. And then she walked away. I had to go sit back down with those kids. They may not have technically been in a cult, but most religion toes the line anyway. When my parents told me they'd let me die, rather than allow me to get certain medical procedures. This happened to my classmate in the 5th grade. Her family were Jehovah's Witnesses. She needed a blood transfusion, but the family refused and she died. I don't remember the specifics of her condition, but WTF. The whole class cried for weeks. Try wrapping your little 11-year-old brain around that. Ex-Jehovah's Witnessing. My first hint that something was wrong was the amount of control exerted in our day-to-day lives. No beards, no long hair for men, no tattoos or piercings, no shirts with edgy artwork like band shirts or shirts with skulls, no entertainment they don't approve of, etc. Other witnesses are trained to report you to the elders if you're not following their guidelines, such as if you have a position of respect in the congregation but someone sees that you have a rated R movie. They'll report you to the elders and you could lose your position and good standing, which will change the way the congregation treats you. What really tipped it over the edge for me though was their doctrine that all non-witnesses deserve to die at Armageddon by God's hand, simply for not being witnesses. Armageddon is supposed to be urgently imminent, and over 99.9% of the world will die just because they are not witnesses. That didn't sit right with me. I had been working in retail for some time, and the people I worked with were every bit as intelligent, compassionate and loving as any witness I knew. Eventually, these issues became too great for me to bear, and I committed the ultimate sin, researching information that criticizes the religion. We were taught to be terrified of anything that remotely criticizes the religion and its leaders. I finally pushed against that fear and did the research. Woke up instantly. Realized why they taught us to fear apostate information so much. It's because they know it's all true, and they don't want us to see it. Your story made total sense of something that I have been confused about my entire life. When I was like 8 years old, I had a babysitter who was JW, and whenever she would watch me, she would make sure I had everything I needed. Then she would shut herself in my parents' room and watch MTV. This was in the 90s when all they played was music videos. It seemed to be so important to her, so I never wanted to interrupt. She also helped me if I needed her, but this always struck me as weird. Now in hindsight I feel like she was so unhappy and that was the only escape she had. Am I possibly onto something? Absolutely you are. I sought escape through video games and heavy metal. Of course I had to hide from the congregation that I listened to heavy metal. Many believing witnesses don't even realize they are using these things to escape the misery of being a witness. They simply feel guilty for having a passion that the almighty creator of the universe apparently doesn't want them to have. Most witnesses secretly wish they weren't witnesses. They wish they could be free and express themselves authentically. Sadly, many of them resort to living vicariously through the very people they condemn to destruction. This reminds me of a woman I knew who was kicked out because she left her abusive husband. Initially she was happy to be able to enjoy reading and writing science fiction and even got a few stories published. She then decided she needed to go back to being a witness and had to give up her budding writing career as she wrote sinful things, i.e. monsters and aliens. She was so sad about it, then cut everyone who wasn't a witness out of her life. When I was 5 and the leader, who claimed to receive messages directly from God, accused me of doing something I knew I had not done. This was always my worst fear as a kid in my church. When in the prayer line I was afraid the preachers could read my mind. The church was very big in the gifts of the Spirit. Speaking in tongues and interpretation were everyday events. But what scared me was the thought of their interpretation saying I had an evil demon, or accusing me of something it happened to others. As a result, I put any bad thing that I thought I did in the back of my mind, and partitioned it off in hopes to hide my thoughts. It's not until 30 years later, when I'm starting therapy and talking about this, that I'm really starting to grasp the true impact of it all. When my brother started asking politely how our religion was founded and how our family got involved, and generally just questions about life, they don't believe in evolution or kissing before marriage, and they would bite his head off about it at age 11. It made me realize they were being defensive because they had no answers. If you can't explain why you're in a religion, you get the duck out. When I learned that if a woman was going to be raped, it would be better for her to kill herself than risk having her blood lineage tainted. Former Jehovah's Witness too. The first time I realized something was wrong was when a huge core belief changed in 1995. The end will come before the generation that saw the events of 1914 died. Changed to, well, it's changed 7 times. Since then I was confused, and it didn't compute that my entire life's beliefs changed overnight. I struggled on a while until shortly after my then husband beat the shit out of me, and for some reason he called the elders over to help, and the elders told me be a better wife, so he doesn't get angry. I was done then. Done. If that's the best their God has to offer, then duck off. I was raised in a very strict manner by Church of Christ parents in an extremely legalistic Southern Baptist church. I was extremely sheltered, allowed only one movie maybe, and 1 hour of TV a week. Only Christian movies, books, TV shows, radio, etc. I never interacted with kids outside of the church bubble, as my parents started a Christian school, so that I wouldn't have to go to the evil public school and be brainwashed. For me it was when my pastor and my youth pastor took me aside during a church camp, and said they were worried about my salvation as I hadn't led anyone in the sinner's prayer, and didn't go on visitation, which was door knocking on Sunday afternoons to talk about Jesus. Instead, I played harp as part of the instrumental group every Sunday and Wednesday, and sang in the choir when I wasn't playing, which practiced during the same time as visitation. They basically told me that, since I showed most of the other fruits of the Spirit like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc., they thought I was Christian. But since I openly boycotted visitation, and hadn't borne any of the bringing new sheep into the flock fruit, by leading anyone in the sinner's prayer, I couldn't possibly be a full Christian, and they wanted me to work on that. I was 15. I never interacted with non-Christians, and was part of the instrumental group and choir which practiced during visitation. How could I do that, if everyone I knew was already Christian? It led to some serious questions, but I couldn't really do anything, until I escaped to college 3 years later. My aunt and uncle joined a radical sect of the Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists don't allow dancing, cards, chess, checkers and most board games. They can't go to plays, or partake in anything that isn't harmless, but it isn't clear what is holy, and what is profane. That means that sports and even watching TV are really unacceptable, unless somehow religiously aligned. My cousins were fascinating. Their parents joined the global mission arm, and became missionaries professional, and lived in Argentina, Thailand and Africa. My cousins would come to North America every so often to see family, but were so bizarre, because they had no cultural references. They were raised in a cloistered community with little to no outside influence, so they didn't know music, arts, or pop culture. They had never heard most music or even seen a Gilbert Sullivan play. They would come to us and talk about the church, but there was no way me or my other cousins would give up our lives to live in some quasi-monastic world. Their parents abandoned the church after a number of years and became mainliners. But for a good 7 years, my cousins were like people who had been unfrozen from a glacier and trying to navigate life as interlopers. Our art teacher was off sick, and the substitute teacher told us the same Bible story from the week before, but with a completely different ending. Do you remember the story or alternate ending? I'm curious as to how it was changed. It was over 30 years ago, so I don't recall. Unfortunately, I do remember receiving an absolute bollocking from the headmistress though for questioning the word of God. I was done with religion from that day onwards. I was born into a Jewish cult. There is a long list of reasons which made me realize that something isn't right. The doomsday prophecies were not happening. The rabbi claimed that we the cult members were in fault for all the world's problems, as he still does to this day, and that the level of our success precipitates to the rest of the world. Every time I independently checked, which was encouraged, I couldn't find the smallest evidence for these claims. The cult was secretive, especially for children and adolescents. So when I became old enough to spread the word, I had to deal with external criticism and my intense anxiety that my classmates would find out and ridicule me. A lot of parents homeschooled their kids to avoid these problems. Luckily enough for me, my parents decided against it. Also, I understood that I really don't want to be waking up at 2:30 a.m. every day for the rest of my life to study wisdom texts. There are so many more reasons. That all culminated at one point where I decided to leave the cult all of a sudden, when I was 16. There were so many reasons, because I sincerely believed what I was being taught to my very last day in the cult, until I couldn't ignore my doubts any longer. I was raised with the belief that, if I followed all the rules, and was a good person, I'd feel a confirmation of everything. 7-year-old me was well aware that I had yet to feel it, and that was one of the many things that led to becoming depressed at the age of 12. I kept having questions that I had no answer for other than God works in mysterious ways. Eventually, I found a YouTube channel where the person told about how they left the religion, and I realized my whole life was a lie, and that I no longer had to try and believe in something that never worked for me. Recently, I'm 41 years old and kind of had the blindfold pulled that a lot of the evangelical organizations I've worked with in my life have been cults. In my teens we went to a church that told you who you could hang out with, what you could watch on TV, what movies you could see, and picked who within the church you could be friends with. 99% of the leaders told you how to run your family, but had kids who were either teenage pregnancies or a baby daddy, illiterate homeschoolers, high school dropouts or drug addicts. There were stretches where we went to church 10 times a day even during the week. They encouraged people to get their kids out of school for revival meetings. Homeschoolers postponed their classes, it was consuming. They started arranged marriages, with several families petitioning my parents for me to marry their daughters. They almost went for it, but stopped because it seemed weird. As I moved off to college they recommended a mega church they got a lot of their messages and such from. This church did more of the same. They encouraged high school seniors to put off college a year and pay the church $3,000 for an opportunity to work there for a year for an internship program that guaranteed ministry work experience. This program micromanaged your life to the hour, included intense hazing for new members that routinely sent students to the hospital and stacked them all into student housing so that you could focus more on the program. What was the hazing? They called it boot camp. Essentially take a group of high schoolers with no formal fitness training and put them through physical training so intense that a drill sergeant sees it and says, hey, you need to dial it back some. Sleep deprivation, denial of most food, and give them less than a quarter of the amount of water needed. That's about it. In God's name, Tampa Bay Times. I experienced this. Completely non-consensual. I consider what they did to me rape. It took a decade for me to realize that not all Christians want to bring about the end of the world and drive their pickups into the Capitol 2006 and kill all the politicians and take back America for God. I still hate Christians, but I have acknowledged the existence of multiple good Christians. Not exactly a cult, but it felt that way. Growing up, I went to the church of my religion, where the sermons were always conducted in the language of my heritage. The Sunday school teachers regularly disparaged other religions and ethnicities. During the week, my parents sent me to an after-school program to learn the language of my heritage, during which the other students regularly trashed other ethnicities, races, religions, etc. They only dated other people of my heritage. In college, the people of my heritage only spoke that language to each other and looked down on me because I wanted to speak English. Couldn't stand any of this. Ended up marrying outside of my religion and stopped talking to about 99% of the people in my church. When I read a bedtime story about a little boy who was hit by a car and in the hospital, the boy in the room with him asks if he was Christian. The injured boy says no. The other boy tells him he won't go to heaven unless he's a Christian. So he advises the injured boy to keep his right hand raised to show Jesus that he wanted to be a Christian. The injured boy died during the night, but his right arm was propped up by a pillow and Jesus understood and let him into heaven. When I realized I had been running two versions of truth in my head my whole life. One was the empirical, fact-based reality we actually live in. The other was my church's version of that reality. One day, it clicked that both can't be true, and I was living a lie. I left and had to reevaluate how I wanted to live my life. And I found my genuine life. I was fortunate to have a spouse who was not a member of my church to support me. My family, not so much. Raised in a very culty Church of Christ congregation. At 13 I realized how judgmental everybody was, and that nothing anybody did ever seemed like enough. I began suffering from depression, because I realized nothing I do will ever be enough. I tried to be perfect, but it was never good enough for the church or for God. I noticed the gossip and negative attitudes toward one another when backs were turned. But when speaking to each other everybody pretended they weren't just talking shit about them. I noticed it was unusual that we were not allowed to hang out with anyone other than people who were in our church. Was weirded out when people from church starting arriving at my house unannounced and inviting themselves in to talk about my church attendance recently. Noticing the shitty attitude and weird social rules of the church was eventually followed. I realized none of it made logical sense either. As I slowly became a lover of science. There's one of those just across the fence by my house. My neighborhood has a gate with a keyed lock on it where we can get into the parking lot of the church and have quicker access to the strip mall next door. My kids sometimes play in the grass field, which the church gave permission for. Their sign next to the road usually says something like classes on how to be a good wife and crap like that. Roll my eyes something hard when I pass it. When I saw the adults speaking in tongues while waving their hands to the sky and fall into the floor when the pastor touched them, I knew something was wrong. Even as a child, it also felt weird when they would march all the kids in front of the congregation to one by one say we accept the teaching of Christ while eating his body and drinking his blood for communion. I still have the damn pledge to the Christian flag, memorized 30 years later. Raised in a cult in Ireland, known as Dippers Cook in the Ice. It was absolutely crazy and my family are all members, and had to disown me, and shun me, when I came out as gay. The other members within the family discussed it, and decided it was necessary to strip me of any inheritance, and any relationship with my family and other members of our religion. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.